Okay, slide 13. This is slide 13. So this map gives you, this is one of the better ones I've found on the web. It gives you an idea of what we're talking about when we speak of dispersal of different ethnic groups. I want to take a moment here to discuss something else that's related to that. But first take a look at where the Han Chinese are. And note that the Han Chinese, who are the majority, they're like 95% or something like that, maybe 92% of the total population. The Han Chinese occupy the parts of China which are the heartland, considered the heartland of China, and which have the most, the best agricultural production. And these are also the places that have most of the industry. There's very little industry, for example, in Tibet. There's very little industry in Xinjiang, which lies in the far west of the People's Republic there, where you see the word Uyghur, U-I-G-H-U-R, Uyghur. So there's some places that are very sparsely populated, in yellow there. We have some places like that in the United States, too. But actually, our sparsely populated areas are not as sparsely populated as those you see here. Indeed, our big cities, one of the striking things you'll notice if you go to China is if you walk in a Chinese city, walk around in a Chinese city, whether it's one of the oft-visited ones by foreigners, Beijing, Shanghai, Guangzhou, otherwise known as Canton, in the south there, or if you go to any other large or medium-sized city, you'll notice the enormous number of people per square mile. That number of people is significantly large in the east, and in a few places like Chengdu in the southwest of China, actually the south-central part of the PRC, Chengdu, Chongqing, you'll see that in the bottom center of this map, C-H-O-N-G-Q-I-N-G, previously known as Chongqing. Chongqing is China's largest city now. I forget how many people live there. It's something like 20 million. It's a ridiculous number. So the people who are Han Chinese speak some variant of the Chinese language that actually these variants can be as different from each other as French and Spanish and English. Now, French and Spanish are Romance languages and English is not. But there is just as much difference between English and French as there is between Mandarin, which is taught in the schools nationwide and is originally from Beijing, and Cantonese, which is from southern China, Guangdong, Guangzhou. There's an enormous difference between them. However, there are some words that are similar. For example, the word for Communist Party in Mandarin is Gong Chandang. Again, Gong Chandang. In Cantonese, it's Gong Chandong. Gong Chandong. But there are other words that are completely dissimilar. For example, the word for no in Cantonese is hung. In Mandarin, it's bu. There are lots of differences like this. But they are Sinitic languages. They're part of the same language family, the Sino language family. You look at other languages in this that go with people on this map. Korean, in the top right of the map in the northwest, where the orange is there. Korean is a Turkic language, as is Mongolian. It's more related to Turkish than it is to Chinese, even though the Chinese language was learned by the literati in past eras in Korea for different reasons. Uyghur in the west is a Turkish language. Tibetan, as I recall, is a Burman language. It's more related to Burmese. So there are not only these linguistic differences, but there are immense cultural differences between these peoples. Differences which have not been useful in allowing them to get along with each other. More about that later. Let's go on to slide 14. Now, all maps are made by people. All people who make maps have their peccadillos as well as their motivations. And this map was made by a European. It shows that that India, controlled by the British, which also includes present-day Pakistan, seems to include Tibet. It was not quite that way, especially in 1808, but later on the British did actually dominate the affairs of Tibet during a weak point in the last part of the Qing dynasty. But you'll see, too, that at this point, recognized by the European mapmaker, was Chinese suzerainty over Korea and over Vietnam and Indochina and even down into Malaya. And that's because the kingdoms in these areas were paying tribute to the Chinese. They weren't allowing, all of them anyway, the Chinese to control their foreign policy, but they were deferring to China in many ways, which we won't be exploring too much in this course. But the main thing was that China was considered not only the cultural center of Asia at this period, it was also considered to be the political center of Asia at this period. And when countries came into contact with foreigners, they would make sure to notify the Chinese about what was going on. Let's go on to the next slide, which is now slide 15. So this slide on the top of the map, in the top left, shows Qing China at its height, and it's really more reflective of China not in 1900 but in 1800. I think it's a more truthful map of Chinese influence when it comes to the southwest, because until the early part of the 19th century, China was firmly in control, really the middle. They were firmly in control of Tibet and firmly in control of Xinjiang. They had, we'll get into more details about that later, but the Qing dynasty during its apogee in the 18th century, that's the 1700s, had projected its power very effectively into those two western regions and into Mongolia. But then after 1950, things were a bit different. China controlled Tibet completely. They controlled Xinjiang completely. They had lost Mongolia to the Russians. North Korea was similar to an old-fashioned tribute state in some ways, anyway. Not a twin or anything, but in some very key ways. And we'll get into more of that as we further explore in this course. Let's go on to slide 16. So the changes that occurred in Asia and China between the 18th century and into the 19th century, that's from the 1700s into the 1800s, were huge. Going from a China-centric international system of tribute relations to something completely different was a very huge change. There are elements of our readings that go into the tribute system in some detail, but suffice it to say that what this meant was that surrounding governments that the Chinese did not want to control, did not want to have to expend resources to conquer, knew that if they simply paid respects to China and did not allow other powers to come in and potentially threaten the periphery of China, that everything would be fine. The Chinese would leave them alone. And part of this was recognizing that the emperor was the most important political and religious figure in the region. This didn't work so well with the Japanese as it did with other powers, but other powers on the periphery of China generally accepted this relationship, and I'm speaking specifically about the Mongolians, the Tibetans to some degree, the Burmans, the Burmese, the people of Indochina, the kingdoms there, including the Vietnamese, and even down into present-day Malaysia, and not including the Philippines, which is a great exception because the Spanish controlled the Philippines and were uninterested in paying any attention to China in that way. They were an imperial power of their own, of course. So going from the 1700s to the 1800s, where China was basically in control of everything and nobody messed with China, and any Westerners present, which they were present in significant numbers here and there throughout Southeast and Northeast Asia as traders, were itinerant. They were no security threat. They were not running around with modern military technology trying to take over things. But that did happen in the 19th century, starting in 1839 with the British entering into a war against China, which we will explore in a little bit. As well, there were revolutionary attempts to erase foreign influence and indeed to erase the influence of old China itself. The revolution, the first revolution that occurred in 1911 toppled the imperial system, but replaced it with absolutely nothing except chaos. Warlordism, as we'll get into. There's a fairly decent representation of this, dramatic though it is, in one of the films I've put on D2L, which if you haven't seen it, you certainly should. The film by Bertolucci, The Last Emperor. It's a bit dramatic. It goes off onto tangents about things that don't matter much to historians, but it does represent the times that are examined fairly well. Since the death of Mao Zedong, Chairman Mao in 1976, there have been plenty of other changes as well, which we will look at in the last part of this course. And the big question is, will the hitherto peaceful relations, albeit troubled, between China and the major Western powers continue in their present, not particularly happy, but not unhappy state? That's a big question. Go on to slide 17. So, as in Europe, changes that come with industrialization, with the Industrial Revolution, that you see listed here on the left, 50 years before, 30 to 50 years before, came to East Asia in the late part of the 19th century and into the 20th century. But they also included this very disruptive importation of Western ideologies and religions and tastes, a very severe set of social changes, including revolution, a strong sense of being really pissed off about the injustices visited upon China by outside powers, and indeed more widely in Asia, this sense of national injustice that developed with nationalism as a relatively new thing in East Asia um, came swifter and faster in East Asia and in China than it had in Europe or the United States. So we have a more recent development of nationalism than we had in Europe. It doesn't mean that it's stronger necessarily. It doesn't mean that it's more brutal or less sophisticated. It just means that it's more recent. Let's go on to slide 18. So in this course, again, I want you to understand these historical foundations of Greater China, as people like to call it. That's not only the PRC, People's Republic of China, and its disparate parts such as Tibet and Xinjiang, but also Hong Kong, Macau, and Taiwan. And understand how the difficulties of the 19th and 20th centuries with foreign intervention in China played a role in the country's history, and what were the roles of these countries you see listed here: Japan, the U.S., Britain, and Russia. And as I said before, appreciate the diversity of peoples and all that stuff. So let's continue here. I hope YouTube holds up. My two other goals listed here on slide 19 are to, again, help you produce decent written work so that you will survive and not become somebody pushing a cart around on the streets. Have a decent career, be able to feed your family, etc. These things are all important to me, as they are to you. To do that, of course, you can go out and get any sort of job you want after college, but if you want the sort of job that college is intended to prepare you for, then you'd better learn to write. If you don't know how to write now, again, I will help you. I don't want to harp on that anymore. There I go again. And I want you to be able to examine critically the problems of Asian and Chinese history as they are represented to us in films. One of those problems in the older films is that there was very little attempt at historical realism, although there are moments in this, my bad boy example of a film about China is 55 Days in Peking with Charlton Heston and Ava Gardner, which included this actress, Flora Robeson, who had played Queen Elizabeth I in Fire Over England in 1937, and perhaps that's why she was cast as a Chinese person. She was your typical English Rose, a Caucasian English lady actress from the period, and she was cast as the Empress Dowager, a Manchu, aging Manchu princess who became Empress of China. So maybe that's good news for Helen Mirren and Cate Blanchett in their continuing careers as they approach what would be for others retirement. But never mind. We'll stop here. That is the end of the first session, and we'll go on to part 2, the Qing and Manchu Dynasty legacy, in the next recording that I will post. Thank you very much.